prepared for our public space. I'd like to acknowledge all the embassy people who are here and the ambassadors. Thank you for coming. And if there are any officials, as they say, protocol observed. Thank you everyone for coming. We're going to start off quite soon. I just want to tell you that yesterday we had some living legends at the museum. One of them was Dr. Don Matera, Don as is commonly and affectionately known. And he's given me permission to use some of his words, which I just like to quickly read to you. It says, God willing, I've prayed for all my families. Now my focus is on all the scarred people of South Africa who are hurting deeply inside, while others kill one another, kill women and children. We are told that accurate racism, tribalism, ethnicity, greed and hatred against whites, blacks, colors, Indians and foreigners is growing fast and furiously in South Africa, including intra-tribal murders. The police force has been sorely targeted countrywide. Some say that our country is on a tumultuous brink of collapse soon, but some of us caringly say it is time for the healing, time for the people to wake up and change the national mess inside and outside of our people, in order to save our children of today and tomorrow from the grim, growing internal pessimism and acrimony sweeping across the beloved country. From Dr. Don Matera, the Bard of Compassion and Liberation. Welcome and thank you. Thank you. I will just introduce Eusebius Makaiser and he will introduce the panel. I'd like to say that again, thank you to the panel for participating today. Thank you again, Eusebius, for moderating. Eusebius, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is a journalist, a broadcaster, an author, amongst many other things. He's also a political, social commentator, and I'm sure you've heard him on the radio, and he's also been a moderator for our public programs over a period of about 2.5 years now. And we appreciate his insights and the skill that he brings to these sessions. Thank you, Eusebius.
Testing. Testing 1, 2. Is this on? Yeah, I'm just going to stand up. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's debate, and I want us to get straight into it, really. It is the biggest debate that we've had so far in terms of public interest and media interest. And Wade and I were trying to reflect on why that is the case, and we're not quite sure, we're just speculating. I think there's a couple of reasons, and I want to make 3 points shortly by way of framing the debate, and then we will get into it. The process for this afternoon is very simple. We've got 4 excellent panelists. Each one of them will have 7 minutes to make opening remarks, no more. After that, it is over to you. And we're going to finish by sometime between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. I know it will be very difficult. Everyone wants to have a say. This is a very important but also a very provocative title that we have chosen, and deliberately so. But many of you have traveled far. You will need to go back to your places. And we have a very unorthodox success criterion for our events. If you feel as if the event should have gone on longer, we take that not as a diss, but as a sign that it was a success. So we will wrap it up quite neatly. You're most welcome to stay behind. There's some drinks and some snacks, and a lot of people often have their most honest conversation, not during the formal part of events, but often during the informal sessions as well. But I really would like to welcome you for being here today. It's a public holiday, although an important one. Many people often rightly choose the opportunity to have a little bit of a break from the dreariness of everyday work. So thank you so much for coming out to this incredible space, which is a really apt space as well for this kind of topic to be debated in. First and foremost, I want to introduce all of my panelists. We have carefully selected all of them for very specific reasons. In my head, I've played Sangoma, trying to predict where each of them will position themselves. I will tell you at the end whether I turned out to be correct, whether I know their work as closely as I do. From my immediate right and then all the way to the far right, which has nothing to do with their ideological positioning. First and foremost, I want to introduce Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Sizwe is well known in South Africa as one of our best new, no longer emerging, but actually already an established voice on social and political discourse. Him and Karima already had a vigorous debate about the EFF in the holding room. And Sizwe, of course, is a doctoral candidate in international relations at Oxford University. He's already got his master's degree from Oxford with distinction, might I add. So he is an academic. He's also a rep artist, and he is someone who cares deeply about activism and about justice. Can we please welcome Sizwe to this discussion? Okay, next to Sizwe we have Karima Brown. Karima, if there is a job in media, she has done it. She has been a media executive in charge of at least 18 titles at independent media. She has been a founding editor of a magazine, Forbes Women Africa. She has worked as a political editor at Business Day. She is the host of the Karima Brown Show currently on 702. She's a political analyst. She's one of our veteran political reporters in the country. And she's even worked before at the SABC in many jobs. So she really has an incredible pedigree. And she is truly, in that modern parlance, someone who is platform agnostic and who pushes her political journalism across many platforms and has done so, quite frankly, for several decades, and a very important voice. Can we please welcome Karima as well? Next to Karima, I am particularly excited, not that the other three don't excite me, but I speak to them more often than I do Lebogang Pheko. Lebogang is, I think, one of our fiercest, in the good sense of the word, minds in the country. Absolutely brilliant. She has a background in law as well as in public policy. She is the founder of a management consultancy. She is excellent on economic policy as well as the interpretation of data to try and make sense of both economic and social policy in this country. She is one of the best and most natural debaters you can get, as Mr. Fasagi found out when he tried to touch her on a studio. And if it was up to me, we would all hear from Lebogang every week in a public platform. And it is almost a rare treat that she's here. I suspect many of you are here, particularly because she's here. Can we please welcome Lebogang Pheko? And then last but not least, we have Sela Hatang, who of course is the CEO of the Mandela Foundation, Nelson Mandela Foundation. He is an absolutely fascinating, energetic South African. If he is not hiking or running up the Westcliff stairs, he's busy giving my colleague Stephen Groothuis trouble about the old South African flag. Selo's background is in history, like many of us. Selo's life, in terms of where his adult life took him, began with a teacher that is a touch point in your life. In his case, it was a history teacher. He wanted to become a history teacher, but thought he won't make much money. But he did study, nevertheless, archival science, and that took him to the South African archives, where he's done incredible work. That's also where his interest in Madiba as a subject, both Madiba, the myth, and the historical man, started in between his work with the South African Human Rights Commission to try and make sure that their work and profile is better understood in the country. And now, of course, he has a deep interest as a commentator in his own right, not just as the boss of the Mandela Foundation. And I think that his work in particular, although he's very prominent, I think it's also underappreciated. And what I love about Selo, and here's a prediction, I think it will be part of his opening remarks, is that he's particularly interested in reviving the real Madiba to the surface, because all of us have our favorite Nelson Mandela. And I think under Selo, we're beginning to see a reimagining in the public space of who Nelson Mandela truly was, and not the partial Nelson Mandela that a lot of people have. So once again, can we put our hands together and just welcome all of them? Thank you. So there's really just 3 points that I want to make in terms of the backdrop to this debate. The first is that today is Human Rights Day, and there's a massive gap between the normativity of the Constitution and the injustices in our country. And for us, that is one reason why Wadey and I decided to put on this debate. We need to account, and we need to understand why it is that that gap is not getting smaller. And we export jurisprudence that is liberal, that is inclusive, and yet the reality for most South Africans is that they are actually marginalized. So that's the first observation, and I will just leave it there. The second is that while it is important to be solution-oriented, we have far too few public events in South Africa that are backward-looking. We are scared to do historical analysis because we are so anxious to find the solutions for the status quo. And there's nothing wrong with going into the solution space, and I've given my speakers carte blanche to say whatever they want. but we deliberately wanted to frame a discussion that looks back over our shoulders rather than into the future, because we've got to ask ourselves, where do we come from? So that's the second point I want to make, just by way of framing. And then the last one, which really segues nicely from the second one, I think, is that in the limited historical discussions that do take place, and there's not enough of them, we tend to have an understanding of the proximate causes of our injustices. 2 words, Jacob Zuma. Alternatively, when we go deep into history, it is colonialism and apartheid. And Wadey and I wanted to ask the question, what happened in between? We know that colonialism was a bastard. We know that Jacob Zuma was something. But what about that moment in 1994, and what about the Kodesa years leading up to it? And I think now, with the passage of time, we are in a position to ask critical questions, not just about Mandela the individual, but also, and this was deliberate in the wording of today's question, Mandela's government, and whether or not there's accounting to be done there, and to ask all of those questions. So with that said, I'm going to ask Sizwe to open us. I'm sorry we're not slightly elevated. I'm standing so that all of you can see me, but I'm going to ask my panelists to do whatever's comfortable for them. If they want to sit, that's fine. And just listen very clearly to what they have to say. Can we please give Sizwe a round of applause? He's going to make the first intervention.
Thanks very much. It's really wonderful to see such a packed house for such an important debate. Eusebius, thanks very much for the introduction. On Karima, Sislebuchang, and Tatiselo, it's really wonderful to share this platform with you. Thank you very much. I begin my book, Democracy and Delusion, with the following statement. 2 decades of rainbow mythology have soothed South Africa into a state of chronic complacency. We were sold a lie that the vote would resolve our country's fundamental problems if we only had the patience to wait. To move forward, we must have the courage to scrutinize the comfort of our complacency. And what I was trying to do with that statement was shake us out of the complacency that I think has defined the last 24 years, and to really ask us, implore us all, to take a very hard look at our society. The other thing I was trying to do with that statement was to try to wipe away some of the narratives that prevent us from taking a very hard look at our society. Those narratives are the miracle narrative. The most dangerous narrative you can found a nation on is a miracle. The hope narrative, the idea that you should postpone accountability because hope is just around the corner. And the progress narrative, that there is this linear progress that is gripping our country, and even though we can't actually see it, somewhere in some abstract place, progress is marching on. And I wanted to challenge those views. But I didn't want to do so in a naive way. And this is really what I would like to bring home in this discussion and debate today. Because on the one hand, it is crucial that we do complicate the very juvenile narratives that surround Mandela, democracy, and the Mandela government. There's no doubt that we deified Mandela unduly and that we're now paying the price for that deification. But we do also need to be honest with ourselves that the opposite narrative, a narrative of total vilification, a narrative which says we didn't win anything, is perhaps popular, but not quite honest. And so the real thing I think we need to be doing in this moment is passing apart where we have won and realizing where there have been victories, and then also passing apart the places where we actually have failed. And that's what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time. So what I'll do is I'll focus first on what I think the failures have been, where we really do need to challenge the Mandela government's role in the paradoxes and the problems that we see in our contemporary society. What I'll do after that is I'll show that the way that history is being marshaled in service of present political agendas. Because as much as this is a debate about the past, it's also about the way that in the present we use the past. And I think that's something that we need to bring out. And then finally, what I'll do is reflect on some of the areas where I do think there were legitimate victories and defend those victories against potential critique. So let's begin with the failures of the Mandela government. And even saying those words seems like a heretical act sometimes. But I think we do need to be quite open and honest about where the Mandela government failed. And for me, the glaring area is around the question of reconciliation, or conciliation, because I don't remember a time we were ever reconciled. And I do think that we allowed a politics of spectacle to overturn a very real cry for actual tangible justice. And I think we went too far, or I wasn't there, Mandela's government went too far in replacing ambitious redistributive change along gender and racial lines and many other lines, and replaced that with a politics of spectacle which symbolized that change, but which was ultimately hollow. And the reason I say that is because I think there's a very firm sense in our society today, it's a sense which I feel, that the beneficiaries of apartheid in general and the people who carried apartheid out never really lost anything significant. And here's the problem. I understand why that calculation was made, to preserve stability and to preserve peace. And we only need to look at war zones to realize the importance of those ideas. But I think the calculation was fundamentally flawed because it did another very surreptitious thing. It imbued our society from its foundation with a sense of impunity. And that impunity, I believe, has spread to the post-democratic era. And so we do have President Zuma turning around and saying, hold on, de Klerk is walking free. Why should I be tried? And I never say this, but he's right. Now, he's also wrong. The answer is to try both of them. It doesn't mean we must exonerate Zuma. But what it does do is it speaks to this foundation of impunity, not just for the functionaries of apartheid, but for white South Africans in general. And that sense of impunity, I think, strikes at the heart of a great deal of anger that is bubbling at the surface of our society. So I would say the attitudes towards reconciliation, the failure to take forward the outcomes of the TRC, particularly around reparation and economic redistribution, and the whole amnesty question and the way it was framed, gave us a short-term reprieve, but has created very long-term systemic problems that lie right at the root of our society that could go off at any time. I would also say that in terms of economic policy, I think there was a great deal of timidity, particularly in the face of international institutions and market-based economic rhetoric. When we look at the way that industry was really tackled, the BEE policy that flowed from the early part of the ANC's tenure in government was its most crass form. And by the way, our current president was a beneficiary of that crass form of BEE. I know he only appeared when he started walking on the Sea Point Promenade, but there is kind of a history to this. And so I do think that it's important that we scrutinize the fact that we didn't get very serious about economic redistribution, and we can go into a bit more detail. What I would say now is that the bargain that was made to postpone justice was only made, and Mandela himself made this very clear, it was only made if that justice actually happened in fairly short order after the period of peace was bought. Now, the problem we have is you can't buy a period of stability and then not do anything with the stability you bought, and that's the problem. Our current failures are exacerbating the way that the past looks like treachery because we are failing to take advantage of the period of time we were given. And so people in the ANC now would turn around and say, no, Mandela's government sold us out. No, you sold us out by not following through on the short period of reprieve that we were given to actually make fundamental change. So I do think it's also important that we focus on the way the past is marshaled to protect the present. So there were important victories, and I'm going to wrap to end off. So stay tuned. But there are some things that we do need to say in mitigation, as it were. Firstly, the Mandela government was actually involved with drafting the Constitution and seeing the Constitution to fruition. That was a big, important victory, I would suggest. Despite some problems which we may have with the Constitution, I think that was a good thing that happened. Mandela's focus on political accountability for senior politicians was also a very good thing, and his decision to step down, I think, does need to be commended. So I think there are quite important victories that did happen at that time that we shouldn't lose sight of. However, those victories do seem to be being surmounted by just the sheer frustration that we find ourselves in. And I'd like to encapsulate that with the verse that I've written to end off, and then it'll be really interesting to hear from you and the fellow panelists. Our juxtaposition, it seems, is we're between Biko's dream and Hollywood screens. And though political freedom was a lifeline, the distance between Alex and Santon is still a lifetime. The crime rate raises my heart rate. This inequality is enough to make your heart break. The disillusionment, the poverty and heartache got me thinking whether we defeated apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you, Sizwe. I can't guarantee that Karima will also rap. But I know that she will critically engage Sizwe. Can we also welcome Karima, please?
So just let me put it out there from the get-go. I can't rap, I don't rap, so I can only speak. Sorry.
Ons hoor jou.
You see, that's experience. It's a very hard taskmaster. You only know that something doesn't work when you're in it. And so it's a really good place for me to start. So I like the critique about the Mandela years, but I think when we put on our lenses to critique that period, we need to remind ourselves of what the world was like when Mandela was facing those choices. And I don't think often enough there is an appreciation of the objective reality as it obtained then. And I think that, for me, is probably the biggest flaw in some of the critique. I think the critique is necessary. I don't think Mandela is a saint. I don't think he's above criticism. And I don't think that he's above mistakes. In fact, he was a remarkable man, but he was a deeply flawed man. He was a leader who made many, many mistakes. But his legacy, his rule, and everything to do with him is a contested space, as it should be. I don't actually mind the contestation. I think there should be more of it. So let's look at the world through which Mandela looked at how to be part of a process that gets us from apartheid colonialism to the democratic breakthrough in 1994. I was looking for something that would kind of root that argument for me, and I came across a quote of Fidel Castro where he spoke about the importance of peace, because peace is often referred to willy-nilly, particularly when we talk about peace and justice. So Fidel Castro says, without peace, we are sure of that, development is not possible. Just as peace would not be possible without development. And I think not enough relevance and importance is attached to that. So when I came across this quote, I made an entry. I said, beautiful and apt quote. So often when we discuss political settlements, especially negotiations, we underestimate and underplay the centrality of the need for peace. Of course, as revolutionaries and progressives, we always add the caveat and the need for a just peace to ensure that peace doesn't trump justice. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's not about the one trumping the other. It's about the dialectic between peace and justice. The one, in many ways, is a necessity for the other to even stand a chance, a remote chance of success. And of course, that's what Sizwe was also talking about, the issue around what we did with that peace dividend and whether we used it to advance the cause of justice. And when we critique that, is that a function of Mandela having sold out, or a government that got sidetracked by the sins of incumbency and the trappings of power, rather than use the enabling mechanisms that are actually all around us in so many of our laws, in so many of our institutions, in so many of the political implements that we have given ourselves. So I think when we evaluate Mandela's legacy, or whether or not his government set us up to fail, we must distinguish between what the democratic breakthrough put in sight and as an offering, and whether we took the opportunity, and more importantly, why it is that we didn't take those opportunities. And of course, when we look at why we didn't take those opportunities, I think it had very little to do with the fact that those policies were unjust or incorrect or not comprehensive enough. If one, for example, catapult that to the current debate about whether the Constitution in its current form allows us to enable land justice and correcting the historical injustices of the past. And the truth is that we are being led by politicians again, and we're being led astray. The Constitution actually has very ample provisions to enable this government to introduce and to enact very radical policies that will actually give the majority a fighting chance. The fact that it is prepared to engage in the politics of ruse around the supposed amendment so that it can now do what it chose not to do for 23 years is just that. It's politics. It's not struggle, and it's not about ordinary people. And we should be really clear and careful to not be misled again by the politics of spectacle, whether it is Jacob Zuma's spectacle or Julius Malema's. If there's one thing that we've learned in this 23 or 24 years, is that we need to take everything that every politician says, including Mandela, with a pinch of salt. We need to not outsource our responsibilities again to big men and women of politics. The responsibility actually starts with us. So in my view, Nelson Mandela left us with a beginning, not an end. 1994 was a beginning. What we choose to do with that beginning is up to us. We can cede it to elites, or we can take charge of it ourselves. But what we can't do is blame Nelson Mandela for the choices that we are making. Thanks.
Thank you, Karima. And our next speaker up is Lebogang.
Thank you. Dumelang. Exe. Eta. Hola. How's it? Yeah, good. So, greetings to all of the speakers, the panelists, points of divergence, points of conflation and agreement, but always deep and mutual respect. And love to all of us here on the commemoration of Sharpeville massacre. So I've got a couple of points of departure and divergence with which I want to frame this particular piece, this particular offering on this day. And I want to ask a question. The question, I'm going to walk around. I'm so sorry. I have to. When I get, yeah, in heels. Huh? So I want to ask a question. What is a sellout and what is its genesis? What is its intention and what is its way of being? Who is responsible for it? And who is responsible for selling a nightmare dressed up as a rainbow dream? And for subverting days like this one? Days like the commemoration of Sharpeville and Langa massacres. So I've been doing a lot of reading and writing on history. So I think that the previous speakers have given us an excellent platform around the recent politics and the recent economics and concessions and structure, architecture of the 1994 transition, which saves me about 4 minutes. I want to contend that memory itself is a human right. what we are enabled to recollect and the way that we're enabled to recollect, including who sold, what was sold, and what was at stake. I think it's also very important for us to remember that memory is an expression of universal humanity, all of our humanity. It's very important for us to understand that these cannot be isolated to an individual, to a chap or a chapette. It cannot be isolated to one event. This has to be situated between structural, systemic, political, economic questions of power, the ceding of power, the transfer of power, the refusal to cede and transfer power. Some of the tensions that previous speakers have spoken about, and we are constantly wrestling with these tensions, the tensions between the past and the present, the tensions between what is and what is not, the tensions between what should be and what actually is. Now, on this day, I'd be doing a great disservice if I didn't go into the dusty history archives for a minute or two. So I want to suggest that one of the first punk out moments or sellout moments or concession moments would probably be 1955, the Kliptown Charter. And this is really the moment where there's a point of departure between the Africanist bloc, and remember that everybody was in the ANC Youth League then. So Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sobukwe, Mr. Tambo, Mr. Mda, etc., etc. These people were all compatriots and comrades together. But basically, this point of departure is really to do with what had birthed the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was a moment for us to think about how we are going to, as African people, claim back our personhood. Who here is holding their ID book? It's not a trick question. Who's holding their ID book? We hold it for all kinds of reasons. Okay. So remember that the ID book is a successor of what? So the passbook was a symbol of black person's personhood. You could not be a human being and present in white spaces without this symbol of a personhood. And we hear stories about people whose lives were put at risk, who died in flames of their homes, racing to excavate this little symbol of their personhood as black people, as African people in this country. So we have to understand that the idea of defying a white capitalist construct of black person's personhood as being to the service, the chattel of white families, white farms, going down white-owned mines, even though the minerals do belong to black people, but going down white-owned mines must not be negated. And that the demands that were made at Sharpeville, when Sobukwe called for people to put down their passbooks, he was calling for them to claim back their black personhood. Okay. So this was actually a powerful assault on white capital. It was a powerful assault on the right to be, the right to exist, and the right to frame ourselves other than in a white person's imagination, and to remove the white gaze from black person's personhood in this country. And Frans Fanon has called this the 17 days that shook South Africa and, in fact, shook the world, and are still shaking the world in different ways. Okay? So I think that 1955 represents the first kind of punk out moment. The second would probably be 1961, where certain factions of what was formerly, Bra Ezra, okay? Friendly face. Where, this was a collective call. History should record that this was a collective call. The call to put down passbooks was made to all political parties, to all social formations, and to all social movements. And one party decided not to participate in this. And a week later, Ntate Albert Luthuli then subsequently went to present himself just after history had passed him by. Just after after the days had shaken the country and shaken the world. Just after people in Sharpeville and Langa had already been martyred to also claim back black personhood. Late, very late. My third point of departure is how and where we house history and memory. And I was very impressed when I sent my remarks of what I was going to say to Ms. Wade here, Davy. And I was like, this is my critique. I'm very uncomfortable in this space. I'm uncomfortable about the way this part, places like the Freedom Park, places like Apartheid Museum, the way that they narrowly curate a particular version of history, her story, our story. I came here, the last time I was here intentionally was like 12, 14 years ago for some post-grad studies. Sobukwe was spelled wrong. And I'm gonna walk around this evening and make sure that Sobukwe has since been spelled correctly. This is very important. It's very important, okay? And I think that also understanding that there's a very contested history to the origins of this particular museum. Most of us know Mike Steinberg, and he has said a few things about how he feels that the Kroc brothers usurped this space, this idea of how memory should be curated from him and from the black population, from the African imagination. So I think these are very important things for us to locate ourselves within. Thirdly, I think that it's also important that the TRC, which has been eloquently alluded to already, as part of the curation of a dishonest, problematic, and parochial approach to the past, comes into the frame. And it owes its being to the legacy of concessions made during the negotiated settlement and has institutionalized mistruths and anti-history, curated by Ndate Dudu, Ndate Mandela, et al. And I believe that a platform to create, to speak truth and create honest dialogue about the causes and consequences of colonial apartheid atrocities instead absolved white capital and white atrocities, institutionalized race oppression and colonialism, and then it forced us as Africans into this microwaved forgiveness and this collective amnesia, and yet history doesn't forget. That is why when people ask, why are you so angry as black people? Why are South Africans so angry? Ha! You need to ask. So I think that official history has decided that nobody is culpable. So that's the next sellout, punk out point. That official history decides that nobody in particular is culpable. It decides that, you know, the freedom fighters and their oppressors are on par. What nonsense is that? Nobody could go to Nuremberg and say that the Nazis and the Jews and all the other people who were in concentration camps were on par. And it should be remembered that elements such as Chase Manhattan and others helped to rescue the apartheid regime back in 1961. Bank of America, First National Bank of Illinois, to the tune of 100 million pounds at the time, and which is worth, I don't know, billions right now. This is very significant because if that had not happened, South Africa would have become a democratic, liberated space in 1961 or 1962, the latest. Journalists such as Alistair Sparks and so many others have written and said that all of the conditions of Sharpeville and Langa mass uprisings were conducive to the immediate transfer of power from African hands, from black hands, from white hands to African hands, immediately. Instead, we had to wait, hope deferred, for 34 bloody years. For something esinyona, not quite even there. Okay? So I want to ask, what are the critical elements in closing of this purported revolution in deliberate snide commas? And what benchmarks are set to evaluate it? If this constitutional democracy and the electoral system that underpins it represent the reversal of the previous political power relations, then we're in trouble, because they don't represent corrective justice, and they don't represent new economic power relations. They've absorbed the existing power relations. They have continued to privilege. And I'm of the opinion that this constitutional democracy is a deep obfuscation and obscuring and intentional diversion from liberation politics. It actually depoliticizes freedom. We have just emerged from 10 years of a constitutionally enabled dictatorship. Call it what you want, but that is my contention. However, it is not entirely fair to lay a portion of blame to one person. Even though Ndate Mandela called the free market economy, which I don't have the time to go into, a magic elixir, and argued that it presented the only hope, and wrongly argued, I argue, the only hope for creating a prosperous and just new South Africa. I still don't think that we can lay a portion entirely to him, even though in many respects, he and others like him were mascots for this project. I would argue that the moderate allies of whom the ANC historically and people like Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sisulu may have represented were then supported by a few key elements. And I argue that systematic, structural, political, economic, and imperial power relations are usually about the elongation of their power, the elongation of their influence, the elongation of their presence, tangible or intangible. Number one, this is through the production and distribution of the economy. Number two, through the control over and production of media and ideas. Number three, the production of ideas in academic spaces. Fees must fall and colonial curricula must fall. And number four, the control of social and political ideas of race-based entitlements using fancy instruments such as the law and such as the Constitution. So empowering black people, oh yes, the elongation of the National Party of Chase Manhattan, of people like Cecil B. Rhodes, of Lonmin, and so many others, among others, are still daintily secured in today's South Africa. Which is why, when there was a massacre called Lonmin, it reminded us of who? It reminded us again of Sharpeville. 30 years later, and still we're being, 40, 50, almost 50 years later, and still we're being mowed down by people who look like us, which shows that white interests can indeed metamorphose and wear a black face. And finally, I want to argue again, who was bought and who was sold off? Memory and the silencing of the less comfortable versions of ourselves, of our recollections, I think is a continued instrument of oppression. Different forms of oppression, discursive oppression, ideological oppression, race oppression. And this includes the ignominy of negotiation with and accommodation of minority whites, usually white minority interests. Proclamation must be a part of liberation. It has to be. We must speak it out. And silence is the part of the sellout. Silence and erasure are part of the real sellout. Misappropriation of voice is part of the real sellout. So I go back to my initial question. What is a sellout? And what is its genesis? Its intention and its way of being. Who was responsible for selling a nightmare dressed as a rainbow dream and for subverting days like this? I want to end with two quotes. I'm not going to say who they're from. You can think about it or ask me about them during the Q&A. The one is, the oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The other is, we are witnesses today of a cold and calculated brutality, the desperate attempts of a dying generation to stay in power. Maibuye.
Thank you to Lebogang. Anyone who moderates when there are cameras around will tell you that a speaker is really on fire when the camera person starts clapping and going. Last but not least, can we put our hands together for Cello, please?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. You know, one of the things that I have to do up front, Eusebius, is a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that rapping has never been my strongest, not even singing. The Soweto Gospel Choir rejected me 5 times, so that should tell you something. I didn't even get to audition. Then the second one is that I'm not here to defend Madiba. Madiba's legacy stands on its own. It does its own thing, and it will keep standing on its own. But if Madiba himself understood that he was never a saint, who am I to crown him sainthood? So he gave this, he said one of the biggest mistakes he made while in prison was to give the false impression that he was a saint. And he says, I never was one, not even on the basis of an earthly definition of a saint, as a sinner who keeps on trying. So based on that, I think we need to be looking at the legacy with a view of us ensuring that legacies live longest, or understanding that legacies live longest when reimagined. So once a legacy it stagnates and it's understood to be, it dies. The second thing is that for a legacy to continue to live, it must remain relevant to today's realities. So are we surprised at the Nelson Mandela Foundation that there have been this uproar of Madiba as being a sellout? We're not. In fact, if anything, it should happen, because you'll remember that today, very few people will ever claim that they supported Zuma. Very few. You'll find it hard, and then you'll find many who claim that we were all for Mbeki to continue and finish his term. So it's a measure of history and time. So time always brings these things back to be new realities. And the sellout, the tag of sellout, similarly, is that of time, as I said. But then, what kind of responses have we heard before? And I'm going to give you three kind of responses we've heard. So there was one response that says, well, Madiba tried his best. You know, in terms of poverty alleviation, he introduced social grants, there was political stability, and a good story to tell. That's good story to tell, the response. The second one is then the one that says, well, he didn't have enough time. 5 years is not enough. You know, so he had to do a lot in the 5 years. Bring a nation together and do all these things. But in fact, if we even talking about time, the Truth Commission's recommendations, and I'm looking at some of the colleagues I worked with at the Truth Commission back then, the recommendations of the Truth Commission as they relate to land reform, as they relate to prosecutions and increased wealth taxes, were never acted upon. Whose responsibility is that? Remembering when the Truth Commission's report was handed in. And it's important. So let's not be ahistorical. When we pass judgments like these, we need to then be putting them against what actually happened during that time. Then another one is, actually Madiba maybe had wrong advisors on the economy. You've heard this one before. So he had many wrong advisors maybe. These chief architects who were behind him and next to him were trying to just push white monopoly capital. Madiba had exigency too. And I think he made some calls. And those calls, you can't then exonerate him from. But I thought, as we deal with this legacy, I called Eusebius and I said, you know, when I first saw the invite, I found it difficult to just say yes, because you are bound to get it wrong either way. Did Madiba's government set us up for failure? You say yes, you're wrong. You say no, you're wrong. So I was saying, these binaries make it so difficult for me because it's complex. And that complexity is acknowledged by Madiba himself in a book that we just published, where he started writing what would have been a sequel to Long Walk to Freedom, and he titled the first chapter, The Challenge of Governing. And that challenge is acknowledging that it was not easy for him to then do what he then had to do. One of the things that we keep forgetting is the fact that as part of the government of Nelson Mandela was the government of national unity. We disavow collective decisions whenever it suits us. I hope so in other words, whenever it suits us, we say, no, that's Madiba. You know, that's a Madiba government thing. But actually there was a government of national unity that included IFP, that included the PAC, the PAC didn't participate. Yeah. So they didn't even make it into the thing. So I think it's those complexities of having to understand that the government of national unity, let's not disavow history, because it's that disavowal that then makes it, we wash it whenever it suits us. I also want to then I want to offer this a bit of context by using the analogy of medicine to make my point. So in 1994, we had a critical and most probably dying patient. And we forget that the apartheid government was a criminal state. You just have to read Van Vieren to understand that it was a criminal state that then ensured that everything that happened in South Africa was criminal. And there, Madiba and his team had to stabilize the patient first so that the patient doesn't die. And it's that measure of what did he do then, the after effects is what we're dealing with today. The medicine that was taken, now we're dealing with the after effects. What do you then do with the after effects? When the doctor says, no, you're going to most probably get a headache, you must drink water. It means we must change. But that's what I find difficult to understand why, with this context that we have, as this patient who was dying, who had to be stabilized, once stable, the next administrations, what do they do to change? And I find it interesting that every time we harp on about what Madiba got wrong, and then I would say, since then, from 1994, what have we changed? What have we changed? Honestly, what have we actually changed? It means that whatever he did back then must have been so good that we still think that medicine is too good to let go. Otherwise, how do you explain not changing? Not changing anything, instead complaining about 94, but not changing anything. That's why the land question, and I like what you, don't know if it's Karima or yourself, the question about land, that we should never be fooled. The constitutional provision was there, has always been there. So we can't now claim, actually it's a new thing. Land is a big issue today, and we don't look at all the facets of land and as it affects our people. In fact, one of my colleagues who might be here is looking at how land affects crashes. A crash. You know how crashes don't get, township crashes especially, don't get any support from government because they don't have title deeds. But instead, we're thinking of land, we don't look at all the facets. How does it affect the child? A township child who is at the age of 0 to 6 is not in any kind of a formal ECD schooling that stimulates them. Instead, they're at home or in a detention center that just holds them for their parents to find them safe, and then they just get handed back. So how do we get that right? I want to then paint a final point before I get off. It's how Madiba found himself in a situation where the military was not on his side, SAPS was not on his side, and within 2 years, he managed to then stabilize the two and get them, these forces. Violence was real. So we should never deny that. And the Mick Madiba is the same Mick Madiba who told Freddie Hartzenbeck and General Viljoen, you might as well get out of my house and go and cause war. Our people will fight you with their stones. They will fight you to the bitter end, and you won't finish us. We are too many. But that war can continue. But you have a choice. You start that war, you must know to rebuild South Africa will be like Mozambique and Angola. And these are choices, real choices that had to be made. I want to end off about how popular Madiba was. So when we did asked my colleagues to just look at some of the stats of how popular Madiba was at the time. And there the stats suggest that with the Mail and Guardian cabinet report, for example, Madiba got a 9, a 5, a 8, and 2 7s. A 9.5 at the end. By 1997, he had a B rating. In terms of popularity by country now, in terms of how South Africans judged him, he moved from 75%, and by the time he gave up power, it was 85% of popularity. Are these figures just from Madiba-phoria? Maybe they are just unreal, but there are statistics that we rely on as people whenever we judge people's popularity. We might have been sold a lie. Progress might maybe not be in our favor. We might have postponed accountability. with a promise of hope. But may we never forget that everything that was done in our country was to ensure that we have a stable country that can reimagine itself for those who are still to be born. That may they be born not under 1993 conditions, but be born in whatever century that they can be born. So for Madiba's centenary, I'm asking you, I'm pleading with you to do one thing. As you reimagine this legacy, let's be truthful with history. But as we become truthful, we must not be then rehashing the past for its sake. Let's not reminisce about the past for its sake. Let's try to reimagine the future that we want for those who are still to be born.